I looked at the theme month that we have this year,
Mhm.
this month in February for Rotary, the peace and conflict resolution prevention. It didn't take me long to think of who's the person that we need to have to kind of set the stage and talk about conflict and controversy. We're very fortunate to have Don Broshar with us. Don has a consulting business now, but is a long time Iowa State University employee. And when I think of groups having to have some discussion about conflict or resolving, or what's the nature, or why they can't seem to get along or figure things out, Don was the guy that we talked to. Don was the guy that was called in. So I've asked Don to kind of give a overview of what he has seen through his career, how this topic has changed, and then some ideas that we can take home. So, without further ado, Don Broshar.
Well, thank you, Craig, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon and interact around this topic of conflict resolution, conflict management. It's been a part of my life for a long time, and I have a lot of interest in it, and hopefully be able to share with you some experiences as well. But let me first of all just share a little bit of my background so that you have some sense of where I'm coming from with my comments. Um, my career started in the late 1970s when I worked for Indian Hills Community College in Ottumwa, Iowa, and I was the director of a youth development program there in which we worked with young people in the community who were having difficulties in their life with their parents, with the schools, with police, and so forth. And so I spent about 4.5 years working with families and community members and the young people, trying to help them figure out what their conflicts were and what they needed to do to address them. And then I spent a short period of time in state government. I spent less than a year working in state government, and it didn't take me long to realize that that's really not where I wanted to be in my life. And so I left state government and went to work for Iowa State University Extension. And I had a great opportunity to, when I worked with Extension, I had many different responsibilities working there. And I started extension work thinking that I would work there about 4 or 5 years and then find a real job. And about 35 years later, I decided that that was the real job that I found, and I loved every minute of it. I started as a county extension director, spent about 4 years there. And for any of you that know anything about extension and especially county extension work, you know that there's a lot of opportunity for conflict in the county. I then went to the campus in 1982, I think it was, and started working in the 4-H youth development program. And for any of you that know anything about the 4-H program and county fairs and state fairs, you know they're breeding grounds for conflict. And so I spent a lot of time at in my position at the state office dealing with conflicts, and they tended to focus a lot around the fair issues. I also had an opportunity to, while I was on campus, to work in community development, and I did a lot of community leadership development work and traveled throughout the state working with organizations, a variety of organizations from private organizations to nonprofit to governmental to educational, just whomever requested the services, I was willing to work with them. Um, one area that we, Alan Vandehar and I, Alan was a coworker in Extension. We used to every summer do a thing called the City Clerks Institute, and we spent some time, a couple of days there, working with the clerks that worked in city governments all over the state of Iowa. Um, and so after about 35 years of leadership development and working in conflict kinds of issues, communication kinds of issues, I retired from Extension, and then I went to work for Iowa State University in their Human Resources Department. Was asked to come and facilitate leadership development for the employees at Iowa State, and I was going to do that for 2 years, and ended up spending 5+ years there and facilitated 5 different workshops over the course of the years. Each year, all 5 courses. Um, and one of those courses was focused on conflict resolution, conflict management issues. And so what I'd like to do, as Greg said, he asked me to kind of look at my career and take an overview of how conflict in my career had changed over time. And so over the past 45+ years of my professional career, I found one thing that is common, and that is that conflict has always been a part of life, and it will always be a part of life. Um, it comes in many sizes and shapes, and everything from individual personal dilemmas to family issues to community concerns. If any of you have ever been involved in consolidating school districts, you understand how conflict gets involved. And I spent some time working with employee to employee conflicts. I've spent time with employer employee conflicts. I've even spent some time looking at differences between states or among states. And I haven't worked in national conflict kinds of issues, but there are plenty of those available as well. I also discovered over the course of the years that conflict comes in 3 different basic types. The first type of conflict, and it's probably the most prevalent type of conflict that we have, is a conflict that comes about because of lack of information or misunderstanding of the information. And I spent many years dealing with those kinds of situations, and I'll share a little bit more about that as well. Second basic type of conflict that I have experienced over the years is the values differences or worldview differences. And all you have to do is turn on TV or read the news, and you see values conflicts all over the place in today's world, especially in our political system. And then the third type of conflict that we really don't see a lot of, or actually talk a lot about, it probably is out there more than what we want to admit, is the whole area of personality disorders. And our mental health is a big part of conflict kinds of situations. And we probably need to start talking about that more and dealing with it. But in my early days of my career, I spent a lot of time in the first type of conflict with the individual, personal dilemmas, family conflict kinds of things, where lack of information or the misunderstanding of information was a big source of the conflict. And I have a personal example that I use constantly, and Craig reminded me that I need to use this one again in this session. But it's a personal family conflict that I had, in my life early as a parent that really drove home this issue of lack of information or misunderstanding of information. When we have 4 children, and when they were young, we did all of our housework and chores on Saturday mornings, and everybody in our family had responsibilities. My responsibility was to vacuum the carpets. My children's responsibility was to get their rooms cleaned up and ready for me to vacuum. And so every Saturday morning, whenever we said, well, it's time to clean up your room, the kids would run off and clean their room, get it ready for me. One Saturday morning, I took my oldest son, which was about 8 or 9, 10 years old at that time, out to the garage after we had gotten our chores done. And I said, we need to clean the garage up and get ready for putting the car in for the fall and winter. And I said, Nathan, why don't you get started cleaning up the garage, and I'm going to run up to the hardware store in town and get some supplies. And so I spent some time and I came back and he was gone. And I knew where he was. He was in the basement playing on his computer games. And so I took him back out to the garage and I said, Nathan, I thought I told you to clean up the garage. And Nathan looked around a little bit and then he looked at me and he said, well, Dad, I did what you told me. I cleaned up the garage. And I said, well, now, Nathan, you don't need to be lying to me. You don't need to, I realize you don't really want to be doing this. But I said, I told you to clean up the garage and you didn't do it. Then he looked around again at the garage and he says, Dad, I did clean up the garage. And I said, okay, that's it. You've really upset me now because you're looking square in my face and lying to me because you just want to go play on your computer. And I said, you didn't do what I told you. And my son, and I'm not going to do what I normally do in a workshop, which is yell at the response, but my son looked me square in the face, and with all the intensity that he could muster, he said to me, Dad, I did clean up the garage just like you told me. And when he said it to me in that way, it caused me to think about things differently. And all of a sudden, all I could think about was, what did clean up the garage mean to my son? And you have to realize I have a background in personal uh, development and counseling. And so I said to my son, what does it mean to clean up the garage? And he looked around and he says, well, it means clean up the garage means pick up everything off the floor, just like cleaning up my room. And it hit me real hard that I had made a huge mistake. I had misunderstood him and what he thought I had said and what he thought I had intended. And so I had to apologize to him, told him that he did exactly what I told him to do based on what he knew clean up the garage meant. It was based upon the fact of cleaning up your room, which meant getting everything off the floor. I looked around. Sure enough, everything was off the floor of the garage. It was all stacked on the workbench. It was in the some shelves that we have, and he had done his job and he had gone back downstairs. So when I use that example of misunderstanding, I am reminded of a plaque that sits on my desk. I don't know if you can see this very well or not, but it sits on my desk and I read this to myself every single day. I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I am not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. And I'll read it again real slowly because it's causes people to have to think a little bit. I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I am not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. And that is, to me, that's the crux of this whole issue of not having all the information, or or misunderstanding the information that you really have. And early in my career, that's where I spent most of my time, working with individuals and groups that were working hard to try to understand each other, and just were missing the boat, and not really finding a solution to their problems. Then in my sort of my middle years of my career, I noticed that the conflicts that I started getting involved in were a lot different than just the lack of information or the misunderstanding of information. They started coming to me in the realm of the second category of conflicts, that being values differences and worldview differences. And again, all you have to do in today's world is just open up the newspaper, or turn on the TV, and you see values differences and worldview differences everywhere. In 1985 and 86, I was lucky enough to be involved in a program called Rural Concerns, which is now called Iowa Concerns. And it was a program that was designed to help farm families deal with their difficulties of the farm crisis of the 1985 and 86. And we spent time hiring staff and training staff to work with farm families and their lenders to deal with the conflicts. And it was very apparent to me that farm families had one set of values and lenders had another set of values, and that they weren't sharing or talking about those values very much. I also had an opportunity then to go up in Northwest Iowa once and work with an organization of about 15 people or so. And the CEO of the organization had called me and asked me if I would come and work on a problem that they had. They had this conflict within the staff that was really affecting their productivity and causing lots of difficulty within the organization. So I went up and spent 2 days working with the staff. First day I spent interviewing all the staff to get a better perspective on what the problem really was. And then the second day we came together as a group and we met, and I shared with them the feedback that they had given me. And I put on the wall a list of 15 different problems that they had all identified as the problem that was creating difficulty. And a lot of it was around values differences, expectations of the workplace and what they thought their jobs were, and other people thought their jobs were different than what they thought their jobs were, all of those kinds of issues. And then the third type of, or the third example around conflict and values differences was when I was doing a workshop for a unit within a very large organization. Um, and after the workshop, the middle manager of that unit called me and asked me if I would come back and visit with him about an issue that they were having with an employee. And so I went in, and he said, "We have an employee who we think is stealing supplies and equipment and from us." And I said, "Well, do you have any proof of that?" And he says, "Yeah, you can sit here at the end of the day, look out the window and watch the employee back the pickup up to the warehouse and just load up the pickup and pull out with a full load of supplies and equipment." And I looked at the manager and I said, "So have you talked to this employee?" And he said, "Well, no, I've talked to several other people about it, and they say that he uh, doesn't see that as stealing, because that equipment and supplies that are in that warehouse have been sitting there for years and nobody's using them. And so he takes them home and then he gives them to his friends, and he shares them with his church and people that can use that stuff. And so his view of that was so drastically different than stealing from the organization. And so I said to the manager, I think you need to talk to the employees. He says, well, we have a very strong union in this organization, and I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to create difficulties with the union. And so I said, let's just call in the union shop or the union uh, uh, representative and see what they have to say. And so we explained the situation to the union representative, and he looked at the manager and he says, I don't understand. He says, why haven't you done something about this? Why haven't you uh, put this person on probation? Or why haven't you actually fired this person? And he said, well, I didn't want to cause any problems with the union. And he says, look, we don't want in the union employees that are behaving this way, because that gives the rest of the union employees bad names. And we have enough problems with that for ourselves anyway. So again, the perspective that people have on the conflict and what it means to them, and the values that they bring, the expectations they bring to the situation, are really difficult kinds of things to work through. But as I worked through these conflicts over the years, I began to notice, and of course, as I got older, I think you tend to get a little more reflective about things in life. But I began to realize that people were changing in the way in which they dealt with conflict. They were beginning to separate themselves, and we began to see like-minded groups forming, and those like-minded groups not sharing with other unlike-minded groups. And so they were less willing to listen, less willing to hear, and as a result of that, become very polarized. And I think today we have an incredible example of the extremely polarized organizations and families and people and countries in our world. And there's very little sharing of differences, because people, well, along about the same time, we saw a rapid increase in technology, and people started using technology to communicate. And by the way, there's research that shows that technology does not increase communication. It actually decreases communication. What it does is it allows us to share information. I mean, obviously, this is a great use of the technology, what we're doing today, but it doesn't allow us to resolve differences. Excuse me. And so people started relying on their technology to deal with conflicts. And if you take nothing else away from what I say today, I want you to understand one thing. Resolving conflict by technology, email, social media is not a good thing. In fact, it even makes the conflict worse. The best way to resolve conflict is face to face. And if you can't do face to face, then telephone or Zoom or whatever kinds of meeting formats we have is better, where you can see the people that you're interacting with and get the clues to their behavior and their comments as you're interacting with those people. But more and more today, I see people relying on technology to get their point across, to share their opinions with each other, and only with people that are like-minded. And they begin then to rely upon authority and power to make their decisions and to resolve the conflict instead of working through the difficulties. And so we have people that are less willing to listen, and because of that, then less able to understand other people's perspective. And we have a lot of fear of sharing our perspectives with people of power. And so you have this fear of sharing truth to power. And so we have in today's world, I think, a higher level of conflict than when I started in my career working with conflict situations. And it takes more skill and ability to work through the conflicts today. But I think one of the things I don't want to leave you with, the as my wife says, you leave me with the sense that there is no hope. And I go, well, no, there is hope, but to have an opportunity to address conflicts, you have to have a process. If you're going to intervene in a conflict situation, you need to have some kind of a process that will allow you to bring the parties together and address it. And the first step in that process is a personal step, in the sense that if you're going to intervene, you better ask yourself, what's your intent for intervening? What's my desired outcome for intervening? Do I want to find fault with people? Do I want to blame others? Do I want to show how smart I am and how dumb other people are? Or do I want to get to the root of the problem and create a solution that we can live with? You need to understand what motivates you to be a part of the resolution process. You also need to know the other people involved. You need to understand them, what their values are, what their expectations are, what their cultural beliefs are, what their norms are. And you need to gather as much information as you can possibly get, which means you have to ask a lot of questions. And when you ask questions, you have to listen and you have to hear what people are saying so that you can begin to understand that perspective, and you can begin to understand that what you heard is indeed what they meant. Um, there's a wonderful book out many years ago called by Stephen Covey called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of those habits is seek first to understand and then to be understood. And so you will never get anywhere in conflict resolution if you come in with the solution and dictate it to other people. You first have to seek to understand their perspective. And then once you have an understanding, you have an obligation to share your perspective, because now it's their point, their time to really understand your perspective as well. So it's a partnership of understanding them first and then them understanding you as well. Excuse me. You need to work in the process to find common ground. Human beings have more in common than they have differences. And if we could just start with common ground and build on that, you have a better chance of resolving the conflicts than if you come in with the solution already created. You need to work at creating a solution that everybody can live with or own, in a sense. It becomes a part of them and their desires as well. And if you can't get to that point, you have to be able to agree to disagree and do it without being disagreeable. Um, and when you get to that point, where conflict resolution is not going to work, you have to begin to talk about managing the conflict, which is a whole nother 4 or 5 sessions about how do you manage the conflict to begin with. So in summary, I just want to end where I started, and that is that conflict is a part of life and always has been and always will be. It is neither good nor bad, right or wrong. It just is. Conflict is what it is. And the more we know about conflict, the more tools we have available to us to resolve the conflict, the better our chances are of reaching a solution that everybody can live with. And with that, I'll entertain any questions or comments or any stories anybody wants to share as well.
Don, I have a question.
Sure.
Go ahead, Jed.
I agree that face-to-face is certainly much better to resolve conflicts. But I have to ask the question, doesn't our US Congress and our legislators belie that theory? They're face-to-face every day, but it seems that the conflict grows or there's not much progress.
And again, it goes back to that values, worldview differences. And until you understand and are willing to work at understanding the other person's point of view, you're not going to make any progress. And so when they sit around and so-called debate, they don't even use real good debate principles. But when they do their debating, it's not a matter of trying to understand the other perspective or even share my perspective. It's for me to tell you how your perspective is not right and mine is right. And so there isn't the environment isn't set up very well for conflict resolution to begin with.
Thank you. I agree.
Does conflict resolution differ from mediation, or is one included in the other?
They're both tools of conflict management and conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is really a process, a facilitated process for sort of a third party, non-engaged party to come in and facilitate people through the trying to understand each other and share their perspectives. Mediation is also a form of facilitated resolution, but it has it's much more structured than conflict resolution. Mediation has a very distinct process. In fact, in 85 and 86, we used the Iowa Mediation Service a lot to work with farm families because they had trained mediators that could come in and they would set parameters and boundaries for the parties involved to be able to work through their conflicts. And one of the first principles of mediation is that both parties have to be willing to come to the table. And sometimes we found that we didn't have that with some farm families and lenders. I remember sitting in a farm kitchen with a family and said, you know, we need to get your lender in here and be a part of this. And the guy looked at me right square in the face and said, there's no way I'm going to let that SOB come into my family and into my home. There's no way that that's ever going to happen. So we couldn't resolve that conflict. We had to go to managing the conflict. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Any other questions or even stories? I'd love to hear people's stories about conflict. If not, thank you for the opportunity. Yeah.
I asked you a question about Congress, so I'll follow up with that. Do you see anything in their protocol or process that works towards the conflict resolution that you're talking about?
I don't see them working towards a conflict resolution, but I do see a beginning of people starting to at least sit and listen to another perspective somewhat. Now, there are individuals in politics and in government and in organizations, schools everywhere that are not open to listening. And that's and yet they'll tell you that they hear you, They hear what the other person says, but they're not listening to what that person is trying to intending for you to understand. And that's the critical part that's missing, I think, from our political system, is listening for intent instead of listening for um, um, blaming, really. We really need to understand what the other person is intending to mean versus what they're just saying. And that's a tough issue. That means it takes time. And of course, in today's world, we don't really want to put in the time that it takes to understand.
Don, that's exactly the question I was going to was, this all takes time. And do you think we'll ever commit to taking the time needed to do that?
I think there are pockets within our society and within organizations that are beginning to realize that it takes time, and they are structuring time to be able to do those kinds of things. But it's not become the norm by any means yet.
Jim, I think you had a question, but you were muted. I could see you were talking. You're still muted.
Okay, how about now?
Do I need to run to the basement and
Hey,
No, unmute. Well, I think the other thing that it points out is this probably is a reason for executive orders, in that Congress is gridlocked. Nobody can see everybody else's viewpoint. And you've got so darn many people running to be the next president the day after you elect the present president. And they're all trying to draw attention to themselves. The more you draw out these differences, the more people you can attract to supporting you and your run. So I don't see a solution.
Well, and I don't, I share some of that same frustration myself, and I certainly don't hold politics up as the model of how to deal with conflict by any means. But I think, and this is a trite saying, but democracy is messy. There's no doubt about it. But people have to begin to understand other people's point of view and not agree with it necessarily, but they have to understand it as that person intends. And sometimes in the conflict, when you're trying to understand the other person's point of view, the other person doesn't even understand their point of view. Sometimes they don't have a point of view. They just have talking points, and they just are out there sharing their perspective of what they think they believe in, but they don't really know what they believe in.
hey, Don,
Yeah.
how about some suggestions of how we might change our everyday habits, activities, whether that be our news sources, people that we coffee with? What can we do to get on the path to understand that other point of view, those other points of view?
Yeah. Unfortunately, our current pandemic, the virus situation has put a real barrier into us trying to do some of that. But I would say that if we didn't have the virus, one of the things that we could do is to look across the room or look across the organization or across the community and identify one or two people that have a different view than we have, and then arrange a time to have coffee or lunch or something and just go talk to that person, not about the issues, but talk to that person as a human being. Because one of the things that gets in the road in conflict resolution is when one party sees another party as not human. And then it's easy to blame them for everything that goes wrong. And if I suddenly realize that this other person has the same basic needs that I have and desires that I have, and that they put their pants on the same way I do, and that they eat and they sleep and they make money, and they do all the same kinds of things that I do, then I begin to see them as a human being, and they can begin to work together. Then they can start to talk about differences. But we talk about the differences before we get into what is the common ground that we have here.
I'd have a comment, Don. This is Bill Kohler, West Liberty, Iowa. I'm chair of the Board of Health of the county. Great problem we have is with school districts. Some school districts want to open up and totally be not virtual, and some want to be part and part hybrid. And then we have those who wish to take vaccines and who wish to not take vaccines. And still they want to commingle with those who want to be safe. So it's an issue of trying to understand those people. And it's an issue of trying to legislate. Right now, we're 47th in the nation on distribution of vaccines. We're all struggling to get the vaccines who want it, but we can't get it. Then there's those, I'll give you an example. My son works for a firm that's got 3,000 people in it. It's a medical firm. They brought the vaccines in for everybody. Only 40% of the people took it. They had those vaccines. Can you imagine those vaccines? You can't crack a vial unless you use them all, and there's 10 in a vial. Sometimes you get 11 out of it. So it really becomes, within a management structure, difficult. But at the same time, you got to sit side by side for a person who decides not to take it, nor wear a mask or follow the instructions by CDC. So understanding sometimes is very, very difficult.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes, as I said, sometimes you can't resolve the issues. You have to manage them. And I'll go back many, many years. Most of you probably remember when we had the big fight in Iowa over whether you could wear or had to wear a seatbelt or not. And my kids today, even my older kids today, don't even understand what the conflict was about wearing seatbelts. They've always worn a seatbelt from day one. And so we had the powers to be in the state had to decide what was the best policy for the common good. And we were going to manage that. There's a wonderful model. Boy, I could talk for days about this stuff, but there's a wonderful model out called the dispute resolution model that talks about managing versus resolving conflict. And if you can't resolve the conflict, which is the first preference, then you have to manage that conflict. And you have to begin to tell people what they have to do in order for the common good. And they may not like it and they may not do it. In fact, there are people driving around today probably that don't put seatbelts on, but they're willing to pay the price if they get stopped and get a ticket. That's just the part of it. So there's a management aspect to conflict as well as resolving conflict.
I would point out in the Rotary magazine for February on page 16 are 5 strategies for conflict resolution.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate you coming on and helping us look at this issue just a little bit different and dissect it. So thank you very much for coming aboard today.